with Cheryl Harris, though I'm happy to give some more names in the conversation if you like. Because Cheryl Harris is probably not as well known in Latin America. She's someone who's published exclusively, I think, in academic legal context. But she wrote a very, very powerful article, first published in the Harvard Law Review, some almost 20 years ago. And this article is called Whiteness as Property. It's a very difficult article, and if I had my way, I would teach it to you, but you'll have to settle for a brief synopsis of her major points. It's a long article. It begins, remember, this is the Harvard Law Review. It begins with a first-person account of the story of her grandmother. A grandmother who passed. Do you know this term passing? Some people are nodding, not everyone. So her grandmother was very fair-skinned, much lighter than me. Someone who could look white, even in the United States, where we have still kind of have the one-drop rule, right? If they can perceive any drop of your blood as being black, then you're black, right? So her grandmother passed, but not for family reasons or for social reasons, but because it was the only way to get a decent job. And her grandmother needed to support the family. So during the day, she worked at a store where she was thought to be white, and in the evening she went home to her family, living in a black neighborhood. This is passing. Now this, for some of you, I see the nodding, is a familiar story. You know this story. But in the Harvard Law Review, I can assure you, very few people knew this story. It was very important to Harris as one of several members of a group that was forming at the time called the Critical Race Theorists, to not only talk about new subject matter, but to explain that subject matter with a different methodology. So to begin a very difficult analytical article about property law in the United States with a first-person account of her grandmother. But of course that in itself would have been insufficient for the Harvard Law Review audience. So she extended the piece to talk about law in the United States from the colonial period into the present, which was then the early 1990s. And she explained why it is that it was necessary in the United States to have affirmative action. She wrote this article at a time when many people in the United States said there was no more extreme racism, and we should dismantle affirmative action because we no longer needed it, because we didn't have the kind of prejudice that was interpersonal as much. So you could walk down the street, you could go to the same bathroom, you could be friends with someone who was white if you were black. And so supposedly this is the disappearance of racism. We can analogize this to today when they talk about President Obama as the proof that there is no racism. I'm not getting any call and response. Do you think that the fact that we have a black president means we have no racism in the United States? Okay. That's what I want to know. All right. So she argued the same thing, that these various changes that could be perceived in society didn't have to do with the most important aspect that affirmative action was to solve. And that was the disappropriation of persons, or the inability for black people to represent themselves as property in the way that whites could represent themselves as property. That they could have what in the law is considered property in the person. even if they had nothing else. So they had access to more wealth. They had entry. And they continued to have what had been accumulated over many generations in their families, even if their own incomes were the same as their black neighbors. So their focus should be, for example, on wealth rather than income. Because wealth would measure many things. Income might measure only your salary for the year, but if you support all the others in your family, or if you support multiple generations, then you are not as wealthy as the person in the classroom next to you, or in the office next to you, who inherited money and has an income, and is not supporting their parents, etc. Right? Common sense. Everything in these books is common sense, only it has to be explained theoretically in order for people to understand why the sociology and economic theory was so wrong. But also, why the cultural theory was wrong. Because the cultural theory was not responding to the charge that there was no more real racism very well. So I want to end by introducing this concept of whiteness not as someone's quality which is personal or individual, but a form of property which can be useful for exchange. Repute, yes. I want to end by making the point that her reference to whiteness is not to speak about a quality which is personal or individual. That is, I am white, if I were white. But rather something which is a form of property, whiteness, which can be exchanged for other forms of property. This seems to me a much neglected but very important aspect of the black feminist theory I know. And it seems incredibly important here in Colombia, where deterritorialization, the loss of property, is very much at the heart of the question of black feminism. Yeah?